So we're up to part two now of Freedom's Boundaries. This period we're talking about the last decade of the 19th century. And this next little block I want to focus on a few things, and these are issues that we'll be addressing throughout the rest of the semester, but I really want to look at it here in this particular period because it does have a bearing on where we are today. And so this is part two, race, ethnicity, and immigration. And again, like I said, you'll see echoes of today often reflected in our past. I realize that as we come into this particular part of history, we're only 3 decades away from the Civil War. And so issues of race and immigration, these are huge issues that are coming up at this particular point. In 1877, Congress essentially turned the South back over to the same leaders who had seceded in the prior decade. And so the South is basically turned back over to the same power structure that had existed prior to the Civil War. And the one big difference, of course, is that slavery is no longer legal. And so the South has to find ways in which it can continue white supremacy, continue white rule, continue white economics, of course, on the back of blacks. And so the first thing they do is they dismantle a lot of the Reconstruction programs. They make it more difficult for people of African descent to vote. They make it harder for them to own property. There are all kinds of what we refer to as Jim Crow laws that are put into place, and those will exist legally and effectively and efficiently and officially right up into the middle of the 20th century. In some places, they still exist in an unofficial capacity. So the Reconstruction programs that were there to educate blacks, to protect them from discrimination and from exploitation, these are pretty much dismantled. And in addition to using sharecropping and tenant farming to replace the economic system that was gone with slavery, and essentially turns out to be more profitable for the landowners in the long run. Another thing that they put into place is what we refer to as the convict lease system, and this is basically chain gangs. This is where you arrest people on minor charges, you keep them in jail as long as possible. So you get laws like anti-vagrancy laws. If a policeman comes up to a man on the street and asks him to empty his pockets, and he doesn't have $1 or $10 or $5 or whatever happens to be that particular town or state's minimum, he's considered to be a vagrant. He's arrested and put into prison, and then he can be left there as long as every time he creates another infraction, his sentence can be extended. This happens in much more subtle ways today, but it was very blatant at the early half of the 20th century. And basically the purpose for this was then those convicts, those prisoners, were then used on the chain gangs to do road work for the county, private building projects. They would be hired out to builders. They'd be hired out to local farmers. Often they would have their own state-owned farm. Essentially, this was a way to get free labor from black people without the institution of slavery. Problem is that the relying on cheap or free labor really doesn't allow for much economic development. It maintains the power of the few that are in power, but it really doesn't lend itself to building factories or building other types of businesses where there would be economic opportunity. And so the South, today remains the poorest part of the country. A lot of this goes back to this hierarchical system of the elites at the top and then poor whites near the bottom, and of course poor blacks at the very, very bottom. For African Americans, especially in the rural areas, in some places there were opportunities, other places there weren't. Most people who were formerly slaves sought land. They saw that as a way to acquire some form of wealth, some form of power, as had the whites that had come to the United States from Europe, both during the colonial period and during the post-colonial period. In urban areas, there were different opportunities and different types of opportunities. And in many cases, urban life provided a network that wasn't available on the rural landscape. These were often black-owned businesses, whether it was insurance companies or stores or other retail outlets or real estate firms or law firms or dentists or whatever it happened to be, all of the various professions and trades. Where in urban areas you usually had an opportunity to network with other African Americans. That wasn't always the case, that you could get services and those types of things from blacks in the South, since you often were at the mercy of the white power structure. In addition, in the urban areas, you begin to see the rise of the black middle class. These are those doctors and lawyers, these school teachers, many mailmen, postal delivery people, different types of government employment, preachers. These are the foundation of the black middle class, and it's at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, that this begins to start to exist in this country. And we end up with a system of almost essentially exclusive labor markets, where blacks work in certain industries, whites work in other industries, and there's really no chance for crossing over. And a lot of this is controlled by the unions. There are small pockets of interracial unionism. For example, in the Postal Service, in many northern cities, blacks were able to join in the regular union, and since it was you become a postal worker not by schmoozing with who's going to hire you. You do it by taking a test. You pass the test, you're in the line of next to be hired, and you get hired. That allows for African Americans to break a lot of barriers. But in the North, in most of the places in the North, blacks and whites were in the same union. In the South, however, that wasn't always the case. They would often have two separate branches of the same union, one for black members and one for white members. So that was one possibility of unions allowing African Americans in. Other unions, such as the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, the IWW, or some of the other smaller unions, were more inclusive. They allowed black men, they allowed black women, they allowed even allowing any kind of women was considered to be extremely progressive at the time. And so there were these small pockets of where unions were helpful for African Americans. And there was a huge movement. This actually goes back as far as the 1850s, before the war. And we often refer to it as the Exoduster movement. And this relates to a guy named Pap Singleton. He and other black leaders at the time were trying to get African Americans to leave the South and to find places where they could build their own communities. They would pool resources. They would build their own towns. And this produced a whole string of towns throughout the southern half of the country, not necessarily in the South, but we're talking about Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California. There are towns that are part of this Exoduster movement. Here in California, it's Allensworth, which is south of here in just down 99. But these were, the idea was, and this interlocked quite nicely with Booker T. Washington, who we'll talk about it another time, that African Americans needed the experience of running their own stores, running their own communities, running police departments, running governments, before they could really fully become part of the American experiment all the way around. And so these exodusters, they were on an exodus, and they were called dusters even before the Dust Bowl, but these exodusters were leaving slave areas and Jim Crow areas later and going into areas where they had a little more opportunity, but by living separately, they hoped that they would be able to acquire the qualifications to then be fully functioning members of American society. And here you see a composite photograph. Actually, you see some African Americans getting on a little steamboat. This is probably on the Ohio River or one of those. It might even be the Mississippi. But in front of it, you see Mr. McClure and Mr. Singleton, who were two of the main leaders of the ex-industrial movement in this particular point in the 19th century. Benjamin Pap Singleton, a man you see on your left there, his son was actually one of the first people to move into Allensworth, south of here, Joshua Singleton. So we have our own ties to this movement here in the San Joaquin Valley. Because of Jim Crow, because of disenfranchisement, because of poll taxes, because of a whole number of attacks on the right of blacks to vote, black politics in the South declined. During Reconstruction, many African Americans served nobly, both in the Senate and in the House of Representatives and at local state houses and mayors. They did quite well. That opportunity was gone by 1877, and the opportunities for men to participate in politics really diminish. And we see a shift where women actually begin organizing, and this is a throwback to earlier activities within the abolition movement. I'm talking here about people like Sojourner Truth and other black women who worked with the women's movement and the abolition movement and the ties that had been very close there. And this continues. One of the reasons why the powers that be in the South maintained this, the inequality that they did, was that they wanted to make sure that poor whites, no matter how poor they were, always sided with the landed gentry, that they always sided with the white power structure. You may be poor, but you're not as bad off as the black man. At least you're white. At least you have that going for you. And this divides two constituencies that really have exactly the same issues as far as being having very little economic opportunity, very little political opportunity. And so over the course of the years, starting in 1877 with the collapse of Reconstruction, black votes are lost state by state, and there's lots and lots of reasons given for them. None of them are good. None of them are valid. They all basically are just racism. The effects of all of this is that blacks in large numbers are purged from voting rolls. Even poor whites become disenfranchised because some, not all, but some, because in some precincts they will actually require the poor whites to either pay the poll tax or to take the literacy exam. And actually we reach the level kind of where we still are in many respects. I mean, people like Judge Roy Moore are great examples of this. Southern politicians that essentially have great power, doesn't matter what they do in their personal lives, doesn't matter what they do in their political lives, they continue to demagogue and to use a combination of fundamentalist religion and white supremacy to maintain their power. And this is all done by the Redeemers. This is a group of Southerners who want to bring back the Southern way of life. You do it without bringing back slavery. You use chain gangs, you use sharecropping, you use tenant farming to replace it. But you maintain white supremacy in the South. And by this point, neither the Senate or the House of Representatives or the Supreme Court could give a rat's ass. They basically just leave the South alone, and it will stay that way until the 1960s. Women did have some opportunities that men didn't, and that was in areas of domestic work. Many Southern black women did, as you see the women in this picture doing, sold their services out as laundresses, as seamstresses, as domestic servants, as nannies, as all kinds of types of jobs that white women didn't want to do. And that will last also right up until the 1960s. When we talk about things like the bus strike in the 1950s and 60s, what we're talking about is the necessity. What will actually break some of the strikes is that if you were middle class, especially in the South in the 1960s, you had servants. and those servants were probably black. And so a boycott of the buses isn't a problem. White women just got together, drove to the black side of town, picked up everybody's nannies and housekeepers, took them back to the white neighborhood, and while their husbands are downtown screaming and hollering about the bus boycott, the white women are actually facilitating the boycott by making it easy for African Americans to not have to ride the bus, because they still get to work because the white women want their nannies. Plessy v. Ferguson, of course, which we'll talk about again later, is a situation where the Supreme Court rules that as long as a private entity or a public entity provides separate but equal accommodations, then you can segregate. This, of course, is done with Plessy. You should have studied Plessy in Poli-Sci 2, or you should have talked about it in your civics class in high school. If not, we will come back to Plessy when we come back to talk about civil rights later. And many of these southern, and from out of Plessy, many southern segregation laws that use this decision of separate but equal are used to segregate whites and blacks. And we still live in a very highly segregated society. In fact, our schools are more segregated today, statistically, than they were in 1954 when Brown v. Board of Education said that schools must be desegregated. The other part of Jim Crow that often isn't talked about is the social part. You were required, it was mandated, that you behave certain ways. If a white person addressed a black person in the South under Jim Crow, often under law, the white person would refer to the black person by their first name in a diminutive, whereas the black person would always have to refer to the white person as Mr. So-and-so, Miss So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so. If a black person was walking down the sidewalk and a white person was walking the other direction, the black person would have to actually step into the gutter and allow the white person to pass, even if there was room for him to pass in the first place. You were not allowed to look a white person directly in the eye in some states. That would be being uppity. It would be being too forward. Essentially, there's a whole long list of things you can and cannot do. And this is deeply ingrained in Southern culture. This also affects other non-white groups. Some of this spills over into Asian groups, spills into Hispanic groups, spills into Native American groups. Essentially, the segregated South perpetuates and perfects white supremacy following the Civil War. At the end of the 19th century and well up into the 1920s, we see a huge cancer of lynching going on in this country. Lynching is any time that someone is executed extra legally. In other words, doesn't go through a trial, doesn't go. Oftentimes these people would be taken out of jails by force. They often would be, people would just go into people's homes. Sometimes they'd be accused, usually of a crime, usually a sexual crime. The rapes would usually, the lynchings would be quite brutal, quite messy. Some of them had the trappings of being official, because they would actually build gallows and crowds would gather. Others would be just go into a black man's house in the middle of the night, drag him out, take him out, hang him up. Well, first you beat him as much as you can, then you castrate him, shove his testicles into his mouth, string him up, and then when he's dead, you cut him down and douse him with gasoline and light him on fire. Not personal or anything. And this is a common. We know of at least 4,300 lynchings that happened during this period, and there's probably dozens and hundreds more that we don't know because they were just never reported. And throughout that entire time, not a single white person is ever convicted of having murdered a black man. And so we do see attempts. There's an anti-lynching campaign that starts in the 19th century, will continue on and off right up until the 1930s. This is a distinctly American phenomenon. There are race issues in other countries, but the modern concept of race, the 5 great races, the white, the red, the yellow, the brown, the black, This is actually a schema called Blumenbach's scheme that was developed in 1776 here in the United States to define race in a new way. Prior to that, race was just a language group, or the people that lived in a single city, or people that were, like the Jews were a race, or people that were of the same religion, or the same nation, or the same city, or the same language group, or whatever. That was a race. Machiavelli in the 15th century talks about the people of the Genoan race, or people of the Athenian race. In other words, people who lived in a city were a separate race. But this race based on color of skin, this is something that's invented in 1775 here in the United States. It is used to justify the genocide of up to 100 million Native Americans and the enslavement at any one time of at least 4.5 million people of African descent. That is why race is invented, and that is why race functions differently in the United States than it does anywhere else. Other countries have racial issues. No other country has the types of issues that we currently have. And the reason for that is that we've never dealt with our history. We take the Civil War, and whites decide, you know what, it wasn't about slavery. It was about a family quarrel. It was really just a bunch of people disagreeing over, it was about states' rights, that's what it was. Which is bullshit. Prior to the war, if you go read the secession speeches, if you read the Articles of Secession, if you read the Constitution of the Confederate States of America, they all clearly state that the purpose of that war was to maintain white supremacy and to maintain the subjugation of people of African descent and all other non-whites. The South has ultimately won because we've been able to take treasonous, racist attitudes and convert them into a noble heritage of the South. You ask most people what happened during Reconstruction, and be, oh, it was a horrible time, Negro rule was horrible. When actually the only South Carolina had a majority of black legislatures during Reconstruction, and they actually passed some really good laws during that time. No other state had Negro rule or black rule during Reconstruction. It was only South Carolina, and there really was no issue. The stereotypes that we think of blacks being lazy, and when they were in the state houses gambling and doing this and that and the other thing, these are images that come out of an old movie called Birth of a Nation. These are stereotypes that were created to denigrate black people. And we also take again, this is a history class. What is history for? Well, history creates memory, shared memory. And what history says is important is what we remember and how we look at the past. And if we erase black people from history, then they didn't do anything. A couple of years ago, the Texas Board of Education removed Thurgood Marshall from the history books and replaced him with Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis is the president of the Confederacy. Thurgood Marshall is the first African-American member of the Supreme Court and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Well, you take one away, blacks haven't done anything. You leave the other one there, he's a traitor. And yet he's in the history books. And Thurgood Marshall isn't. Cesar Chavez isn't either. They took him out and put another white supremacist in there. This is an 1893 lynching of Henry Smith in Paris, Texas. Smith was accused of raping and murdering a 4-year-old girl. No evidence. There's no blood work, of course. There's nothing. He was accused of it. The crowd dragged him out. More than 10,000 showed up. They built the scaffold. They paint the word justice across the front of the platform. And they hanged the guy. No trial, no arrest, no indictment, no testimony, no nothing. In relation to racial issues that are going on at this particular time, there is also a backlash against new immigrants. Now, every generation in the United States has bragged about how we're a nation of immigrants. As we come to the end of the 19th century, we reach a period where we're getting massive numbers of new immigrants, mostly from Europe, although some from Asia as well. And we begin to see a nativism. And in nativism, when we talk about nativism, we're in a point right now where there's a huge nativist movement going on. It's essentially the white supremacist movement. You don't have to be white supremacist to be a nativist, but if it is on racial terms, then there's a very easy slip from nativism to racism. And this, like I said, is a period of time when a lot of new people are coming. And they're viewed as a threat to American democracy. And many of these people are viewed as lower races. In other words, and remember, race is a term that has changed meaning over many, many years. Our modern definition of race has to do with skin color, hair texture, eye color, and eye shape. That's it. 5 little phenotypical markers. The term race in the past has meant a lot more divisions. It could be someone from a nation. It could be someone from a city. I've talked about this already. And there are certain objections to many of these people that are coming over by many of the people that are already here. Now, remember, they're also the children of immigrants, or they're immigrants themselves. And this is a thing that we have done all the way up to the present day, where the last batch of immigrants is now out to get the new batch of immigrants and say, you can't come here because we've already got it and you're just coming here to take our whatever. And so we begin to see concerted efforts around the United States in 2 primary areas initially. First, we see a national organization called the Immigration Restriction League. This is just a group of quote-unquote concerned citizens who are getting together to attempt to impact immigration. Understand, there is no immigration law at this moment in the United States. At this moment in the United States history, if you can get here, then you can go down the path to become a citizen. And it had been that way from 1775 all the way through to, and we'll continue all the way through until about 1921, 1922. There are efforts to bar the arrival of certain people here into the United States. Many states try to use disenfranchisement measures. In other words, they try to take citizenship away or not allow citizenship. And this is really a losing battle. It kind of sets the stage, but it is a losing battle for some in that really it is not legal for the states to do immigration. That is done at the federal level. There are specifics there. I mean, and this was tried just recently. Georgia, a couple of years ago, passed some immigration laws. Arizona tried to do a whole slew of laws. Most professional organizations are still boycotting Arizona for their attempts with SB 1070 and other laws to essentially have a second layer of immigration over and above the federal issues. This is a cartoon from the magazine The Judge, and it really, for me, is one of the best contemporary anti-immigration cartoons that was published at this particular period. And here you see a tide of newcomers, and if your screen is big enough or your resolution is high enough, you'll be able to see that these are people from Argentina, they're people from Mexico, they're people from, these are not coming from France, they're not coming from Germany, they're not coming from England, they're coming from Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, and they're coming from the Baltic states, and they're coming from Italy, they're coming from Southern Europe, they're coming from Eastern Europe, and on the other side of the country, they're coming in from primarily China, Japan, and to a lesser degree the Philippines. And these are viewed just as Trump and his wall are viewed as a way to, these are a threat to American ideas, ideals, and institutions. Of course, the idea that all men are created equal, this shouldn't be a threat to, but it is seen by some as being exactly that. Normally, when we talk about this period in immigration, we talk about people from Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe, and from Ireland. But you have to understand that there also was on this coast a very, very large backlash just 30 years after becoming a state to try to get rid of the Chinese. Now, as soon as California became a state, we put a bounty out on Indians, and many people for 10, 15 years after we were a state made their living by killing Indians. That's just part of living in California. That is, we became a state specifically on the graves of Indians that we legally massacred. By the 1880s, there's a huge backlash against Chinese. Now, Chinese had come here during the gold rush. They referred to California as the Mountain of Gold, or Montaña de Oro in Spanish, the Mountain of Gold. And their plan was to come here, get rich in the gold mines, go back home, build a big house in their village, marry their childhood sweetheart, and live happily ever after. Doesn't really work out, though. And in 1882, we pass at the... in 1881, we actually pass laws that exclude Chinese women. Not men, but women. Those that are here can stay, but those that are not here can't come. So this cuts out the potential mates and partners for the men that are here. On an aside, when I was doing early research on African American communities here in the San Joaquin Valley, this particular period in history is an overlap. It is a period where the Chinese are being reviled and African Americans are actually being recruited to come here to provide labor. And there's many different aspects to that, but you can also really read a lot of what they're saying about the Chinese at this point. And there were two things that I did to try to figure out, try to understand what was happening. And the first was I spent a lot of time in census records, and the second was a lot of time reading old newspaper articles from all over the state. And in 1881, essentially, we exclude the women. In 1882, we passed the Chinese Exclusionary Act. And the idea here is that we want to get as many of the Chinese out as possible. We're actually recruiting African Americans from the South to come and do the labor, primarily because they will come if they're offered lower wages than the Chinese are making. And this really is an economic thing. This has a lot to do with racism. One of the things that they do decide is there's a great article in the California Republican which says that the Chinese will never be real Americans. They dress funny, they eat strange foods, they're all opium addicts, they rape, they crime, all of the stuff that you hear about immigrants. But according to this article, African Americans are citizens. African American, remember, this is only a few years after the end of Reconstruction. But African Americans are citizens. They have a stake here. And then 2 paragraphs down later, it says that you can get a black man for 50% of what they're currently paying the Chinese men. And you can get a black woman for 2/3 of that cost. And you can get a black child to work for half of that. And so for just a little bit more than you're paying for one person, you now get 3 people to work. And so we passed the Chinese Exclusionary Act that doesn't allow any new Chinese to come, and really makes it difficult for the Chinese that are here. We re-upped that again in 1892, and then again in 1902. And the important thing to understand here is this is the only immigration law on the books prior to the 1920s. There is no such thing as immigration law. There's no such thing as an illegal alien. If you can come here, you can become a citizen, unless you're Chinese. This creates a great deal of unrest. Most of the Chinatowns that you see around the valley here, some of them are already disappeared. For example, in Merced, they actually put the freeway right through the Chinatown to try to erase it. Downtown Visalia, Chinatown was burnt, and it was completely destroyed, and very quickly white businesses came in and built over the top of them. In the 1906 earthquake, the first ordinance passed by the San Francisco City Council was to disallow Chinese in San Francisco to own property. In other words, they just took Chinatown over. It took I believe, went all the way to the Supreme Court before they were finally able to move back into Chinatown. So there was a lot of violence against Chinese, a lot of discrimination. And there are a number of different cases, some which support having rights, some don't have. But this bill, the Chinese Exclusionary Act of 1882, 1892, and 1902, is really the precedent, the first time that we choose who can be an American. This is essentially genetic engineering. By determining what color you can be, who you can be, when you can come, how you can come, that if we can legally exclude racial groups or religious groups, this is the whole problem with with Trump's Muslim ban. This country that has this Statue of Liberty that says, "Send us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses," the refuse of the world, really is not a welcoming country for immigrants. It should say, forgive my French, it should just say, "Fuck you." Because that is really the American way. This happens to be Chinatown in Seattle, but it could have been in Chinatown in Hanford. It could have been Chinatown in Visalia, China Alley in Hanford, Chinatown in Visalia, Chinatown here in Fresno, Chinatown in Merced, any Chinatown anywhere in the West Coast. And you can see the same arguments being made decade after decade, era after era. 1870, papists, in other words Catholics, are wrecking our economy with their fecundity. We must erect a wall of brass around the country for the exclusion of all Catholics. And you thought the wall was a new idea. That actually comes from John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. 1850, Chinese immigrants refuse to assimilate, and if we let too many in, they'll undermine our economy. 1920s, now, I've got nothing against Jews, but the Jews are coming in huge numbers and the economy can't take it. And then, of course, today you see the same things being said. History might march on, but nativism does march in place. And it's funny, you never see African Americans say, "Oh, we can't have the Chinese move here. It would destroy our society." You never hear the Chinese Americans say, "Oh, we can't have Mexicans here because they're going to take away our jobs." It is only one group that has historically always attacked every other group. In 1895, Booker T. Washington, who was one of the three major thinkers at the turn of the 20th century into the 20th century within the black community. Booker T. Washington, of course, is the founder of the Tuskegee Institute, and he gives a speech to the Atlanta Growers Association in 1895. Dr. Washington had been the child of slaves, former slaves. He grew up in the South. He knew what life was there. And he was one of the first national leaders of the black community. And he also was a separatist. He felt that as long as the whites and the blacks continued to live together with the tensions that existed at the time, that no progress was going to be made. And he laid some of the responsibility to make that progress on the black community. Right, wrong, or indifferent, he proposed to the Atlanta growers, and this was his approach for most of his career, that blacks really didn't need to get full equality. They would accept segregation. They would accept inequality in politics until such time as they could become equals with whites economically, educationally, and socially. And then they would worry about political equality. Now, of course, this makes the white growers in Atlanta thrilled. And it also increases donations from people like Rockefeller and Carnegie to the Tuskegee Institute. And this goes right back to that exoduster movement that I was talking about earlier. Places like Nicodemus, Kansas, and Boley, Oklahoma, and Allensworth, California. And Booker T. Washington looked at the black community and said, we need skills. We need self-help. We need to work where we can with whites and where we can't work on our own. And so the Tuskegee Institute has always been a hands-on, very much a skills and starts out almost as a vocational school, but it is a full university. But every single brick that was used to build the campus was made by the early students. They built the bricks, they assembled the bricks, they built the buildings. The timber, every board in the original campus was harvested from trees growing on the property and turned into lumber by the students. And the earliest students were trained as school teachers and preachers and farming techniques and the building trades, electricians, gas pipe fitters, plumbers, people who can work with masonry, masons, and those types of things. These were the early trainings to give former slaves. We're only a few years out after this point. Only 2 decades out of Reconstruction. To give these former slaves and their children an economic boost up by providing them with the skills that they need to survive in a white world. There's also a slight change in the approach by labor at this point. The AFL, or the American Federation of Labor, run by Samuel Gompers, was Gompers focuses on a very broad reform of the AFL. He wants to keep them politically engaged. He wants to continue having direct confrontation with capital. But his emphasis is on bargaining over wages and conditions. In other words, he puts forth the idea that you can strike all you want, but if you damage the company so much that then they can't afford you, then you're really shooting yourself in the foot. And so he really pushes for this, what we refer to as business unionism. Yes, I'm looking out for my workers. Yes, I want to get the best deal that I can for my workers on the line, but I also have to look out for the benefit of the company as well. And this has at different times and in different conditions been a positive thing and a not so positive thing. The other thing that the AFL does at this point is it really narrows who can be a member. We're still early in the industrialization of the United States. There's still many skilled laborers that are working in industry. And those skilled workers have an advantage over non-skilled workers in that their skills are still needed in order to produce quality products. You can't replace a master at something with an apprentice or an unskilled laborer. If you have skills that cannot be done by machine or cannot be done by a non-skilled laborer, you have an advantage when it comes to negotiating your hours, to negotiating as to how quickly you can produce the product. If rushing it would mean an inferior product, you can tell your boss, look, I can't make it that way and still have it that quality. And so skilled laborers had control, more control. They had some control over their working conditions and their salary and those types of things. But at the same time that they're focusing here on skilled laborers, they're only focusing on white males, blacks, women, these new immigrants, Native Americans, Chinese. None of these are allowed to even join the union, let alone work in the shops where the union is embedded. If you remember in the earlier lectures on the Progressive Era, I showed you some photographs by a guy named Lewis Hine. And Lewis Hine was one of probably the country's first photojournalist. And he went around and photographed conditions in the cities. A lot of our photographs of the slums of New York from this period are Hine's photographs, as are many of the photographs of exciting technological achievements, skyscrapers and trains and elevators and all of these things. This photograph is actually one from the mines. I believe this is down in Pennsylvania. And this was one of the few places, one of the few jobs where blacks and whites did occasionally work together. The unions in that area didn't care one way or the other, and men that are down in the hole that depend on each other's lives really didn't care as long as the person was there and able-bodied and knew his job. And so race played in some places played a greater or smaller role in the labor force. As far as women, there are widening prospects for economic independence, a little bit. There's a growing network of women's organizations. I mentioned earlier in the Progressive Era that you have these middle class white women whose husbands work in the factories not as laborers but as managers or accountants or white-collar jobs. And they make sufficient money that they have several servants in the home. And a lot of these women have little to do in the home other than supervise their workforce. And so many of them are very devoutly religious. The brand of Christianity that was around at the time was the help the poor type of Christianity, not the help the rich kind of person of Christianity. This was the blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, as you do unto the weak of these, so as you do unto me. That's the Christianity that was prevalent in America at this time. Within 30 years, it will change, and it will be much more according to the gospel of wealth, which is the current mainstream of fundamentalist religion in this country. And you see these women wanting to make improvements. They want to help the poor. They want to help the sick. They want to make conditions better. And so you see a growing network of these women's organizations and campaigns that some start locally and expand. Others are intended to be national from the very beginning. Sometimes those fall down and only cover specific regions. But probably the most powerful one at the time is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. In other words, this is the group that is pushing us state by state toward abolition, where booze is basically illegal everywhere. And there is also a change in the suffrage movement. So you have this one group of women's organizations that are working for social change, and then you also still have the women's suffrage movement, right? They don't vote. Women are still property. Women are still unable to take a loan out on by themselves without the signature of their husband or their father. They're not able to own real property, again, without the permission of their husband. If they're a widow, that's a different issue. But essentially, women are property. I always tell this to my classes, and it always pisses somebody off, but I normally will ask, okay, ladies, how many of you are not married yet? And most of my students are single. There are a few older ones, but most of my students are single. And I'll ask, so how many of you have been planning your wedding since you were 8 years old? And there's usually a few of them they've been dreaming about. It doesn't matter who the guy is. They know what the rest of the wedding is going to look like. And I'll ask them, I'll say, where does the wedding start? How does the wedding begin? And they're not sure what I'm asking. And so I have to kind of clarify and go, okay, where are you going to be when the wedding starts? And they'll all say, in the back of the church or the synagogue or the temple, whatever it happens to be. Because this is true whether we're talking about a Jewish wedding or a Christian wedding or a Muslim wedding. And I'll say, okay, and so who are you with? And most of them say, well, I'm there with my daddy. And I say, and then what do you do? And he goes, well, then they walk, he's going to walk me down the aisle. And I'll say, what is that process called? And without even thinking, it will just come out of their mouths, and it will say, and they will say very clearly, that's giving away the bride. And I'll stop them there and I'll say, listen to the words you just said. What did you just say? And they'll say, giving away the bride. And then I point out the first thing that's said by the priest or the rabbi or the mullah, whoever is the officiant, will almost always be, and who gives this woman and who takes this woman, because that's what it is. It is a transfer of property. And so women at the end of the 19th century don't have the vote. The fact that they're able to get involved in these organizations is really just a big part of it has to do with their status as middle-class women. But even the women's suffrage movement, which initially had been hand in hand with the anti-slavery movement, when men were given the right to vote at the end of with the 15th Amendment, but women weren't, that split those two movements. And it's at this particular point when we begin to see it splinter even more. When when black women and white women and black men were all in the same boat, the groups worked together. Once that is severed with the 15th Amendment, many of these women separate themselves from the people of color. And so you end up with new immigrants aren't part of the suffrage movement. African American women are not part of the suffrage movement. And so there is an ethnic and a racial division between the women involved in the suffrage movement, many of the women involved in the temperance movement, many of the women involved in a lot of these. These are white middle-class women, pretty much across the entire board. And that pretty much pretty much winds up Part 2 of Freedom's Boundaries, dealing with race, ethnicity, and immigration. And there is one more part to this set of lectures, and we can pick that up next time.